Even though Nintendo certainly didn't invent the damsel in distress, the popularity of their Save the Princess formula essentially set the standard for the industry.
This statement doesn't make any sense. Anita says this earlier in the video.
Of course, the damsel in distress predates the invention of video games by several thousand years. The trope can be traced back to ancient Greek mythology with the tale of Perseus. According to the myth, Andromeda is about to be devoured by a sea monster after being chained naked to a rock as human sacrifice. Perseus slays the beast, rescues the princess, and then claims her as his wife.
The first damsel Anita identifies in fiction is a princess from a story thousands of years before Super Mario Bros. Existed. Saving a princess is not a formula Nintendo created.
Even though Nintendo certainly didn't invent the damsel in distress, the popularity of their Save the Princess formula essentially set the standard for the industry.
Anita also claims that Super Mario Bros. Made the Save the Princess trope the standard in video games, even though her own damsel list shows that there were 4 games that had a damseled princess in them starting 5 years before Super Mario Bros. 2 of these games are shown later in her video.
Jordan Mechner's famous Karateka and Prince of Persia games, originally released for the Apple II home computer in the 1980s, have both seen modern HD remakes. And the 1983 animated Laserdisc game Dragons Lair, with ditzy Princess Daphne, has been ported to just about every system imaginable.
Please save me! The cage is locked with a key.
Let's look at each of these games individually. Wizard and the Princess was released in 1980 for the Apple II, and it had been ported to 3 different platforms before 1985. Interesting side note: the game was designed by a woman. Debuting in August 1980, the game sold 25,000 copies by June 1982, tied for 4th on Computer Gaming World's list of top sellers. It sold over 60,000 copies in total. Creative Computing liked Wizard and the Princess, approving of the Atari version's graphics and comparing its difficulty to some of Scott Adams' efforts. The Addison Wesley Book of Atari Software 1984 gave the game an overall B rating, stating that it may well set a standard by which future graphic adventure games will be judged. So you have a game that had the princess damsel trope and was critical and commercial successful 5 years before Super Mario. Arabian was released in arcades in 1983 and ported to the several PC platforms and the Nintendo Entertainment System in 84 and 85. Dragons Lair was released in arcades in 1983. Dragons Lair initially represented high hopes for the then sagging arcade industry, fronting the new wave of immersive laserdisc video games. A quote from Newsweek captures the level of excitement displayed over the game. Dragons Lair is this summer's hottest new toy, the first arcade game in the United States with a movie-quality image to go along with the action. The game has been devouring kids' coins at top speed since it appeared early in July, said Robert Romano, 10, who waited all day in the crush at Castle Park without getting to play. It's the most awesome game I've ever seen in my life. Arcade operators at its release reported long lines, even though the game was the first video arcade game to cost 50 cents. By July 1983, 1,000 machines had been distributed, and there were already a backlog of about 7,500. By the end of 1983, Electronic Games and Electronic Fun were rating Dragons Lair as the #1 video arcade game in USA, while the arcade industry gave it recognition for helping turn around its 1983 financial slump. Dragons Lair received recognition as the most influential game of 1983, to the point that regular computer graphics looked rather elementary compared to top-quality animation. By February 1984, it was reported to have grossed over $32 million for Cinematronics. Dragons Lair was critically and commercially successful 2 years before Super Mario Bros. The game also had a PC port in '84. Karateka was released for the Apple II 1984. The game was considered a bestseller in its original release in 1984, with more than 500,000 copies sold. It was Broadband's best-selling Commodore game as of late 1987.
Even though Nintendo certainly didn't invent the damsel in distress, the popularity of their Save the Princess formula essentially set the standard for the industry.
There are 4 games with the princess damsel trope started 5 years before Super Mario Bros. Games that were critically and commercially successful. Nintendo did not create the trope or popularize its use in video games.
Throughout the 80s and 90s, the trope became so prevalent that it would be nearly impossible to mention them all. There were literally hundreds of examples showing up in platformers, side-scrolling beat-em-ups, first-person shooters, and role-playing games alike.
Anita identified 327 damsel characters in the 80s and 90s. I've identified 775 playable female characters in the same period of time.
The pattern of presenting women as fundamentally weak, ineffective, or ultimately incapable has larger ramifications beyond the characters themselves and the specific games they inhabit. We have to remember that these games don't exist in a vacuum. They are an increasingly important and influential part of our larger social and cultural ecosystem. The reality is, this trope is being used in a real-world context where backward sexist attitudes are already rampant. It's a sad fact that a large percentage of the world's population still clings to the deeply sexist belief that women as a group need to be sheltered, protected, and taken care of by men.
Now, I can already hear the army of Richard Dawkins parroting anti-feminist Twitter users typing up their responses about how Islam is a religion dedicated to oppressing women. It's amazing how suddenly everyone's a feminist when it lets them perpetuate hate against brown people or dismiss concerns about how women are oppressed in their own culture.
Remember, the damsel in distress trope is deeply damaging to women, but Islam is great for women.
The belief that women are somehow a naturally weaker gender is a deeply ingrained, socially constructed myth, which of course is completely false. But the notion is reinforced and perpetuated when women are continuously portrayed as frail, fragile, and vulnerable creatures.
Good thing that's not the way most women are portrayed in video games.
Okay, so we've established that the damsel in distress trope is one of the most widely used gendered cliches in the history of video games, and has been core to the popularization and development of gaming as a medium.
The earliest game Anita shows in her video is Sheriff from 1979. Video games did not begin in 79. There were several arcade games that predate Sheriff, starting in 71 by Spacewar and Computer Space. In 72 Atari was formed and is credited with creating the arcade industry. Starting with Computer Space in 71, there was 95 arcade games released between 71 and 78. The Atari 2600 was released in 1977 and is the first successful home console. The Apple II was also released in 77 and was the first unified PC platform for games. All of this was taking place before Sheriff was released in 79.
Even though Nintendo certainly didn't invent the damsel in distress, the popularity of their Save the Princess formula essentially set the standard for the industry.
Most likely Anita is referring to Super Mario Bros. In '85. Anita seems to think that the trope had something to do with video games becoming popular as a result of it being in Mario games. She fails to understand why the Mario series and gaming as a whole became popular.
I know my stuff, and I'm pretty good at what I do. Despite this fact, there's a widespread perception among mostly male gamers that I somehow still don't understand the games I analyze.
I wonder where people got that ideal from.